Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Allow me to present to you another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read Chapter 10 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Wonder what Chapter 10 has in store for Don and his compadres. Let's find out. I was only able to spend a couple weeks settling Susan and Jesse in, while the rest of the band reacquainted themselves with the inside of the Troubadour Club, before we went back on the road for what turned into a 9-month-long tour. While I was home, I changed diapers, fed and washed Jesse, babysat when Susan needed a break, and enjoyed spending quality time with my new son. We had a Mexican matrimonial hammock in the backyard, and I rigged up a clothesline from it to the house so that I could sit on the couch watching baseball in the living room while rocking Jesse gently to sleep outside. As soon as I stopped during a particularly engrossing part of the game, he'd exercise his lungs and yell just to remind me. I maintained polite long-range contact with my parents ever since moving to LA, sending them the odd card from on the road and calling them once in a while, but I hadn't seen them since my wedding 2 years earlier, and they had never seen Jesse. My brother Jerry, who had 2 kids with Maureen and was living and working in Gainesville as a partner in a law firm he had joined after college, called me to tell me that Dad had finally quit working at Copper's due to ill health. He had never officially retired and was still being paid, but he had congestive heart failure and lung problems, probably exacerbated by years of smoking and inhaling toxic fumes. "You might want to fly down and see him, Don," Jerry advised, long distance. "He's not doing very well." Having a son had considerably mellowed my resentment toward Dad, making me realize how hard it was to be a parent. During a lull in the tour, when I had a week off to spend with my family before we went back on the road, I decided to fly to Florida and reacquaint myself with the old man. We flew to Gainesville and rented a brand new car, which I knew would impress Dad. The house looked just the same, although even smaller than I remembered it. Jesse was just a couple of months old, and when Mom opened the front door of that old clapboard house with the tin roof that Dad had built with his own hands, I felt so proud to hand her my son. She looked a little older, but she was very pleased to see us and to meet her new grandson. "Hi, little Jesse," she said, cradling him in her arms and beaming down at him. "I've waited a long time for this." Jesse gurgled and wriggled on cue and gave her one of his winning smiles. Dad was sitting in an armchair in the lounge, an oxygen tank by his side, a clear plastic tube from it hooked around his nose. He was thin and gaunt, with sunken eyes, and his whole body seemed to have shrunk and caved in as he slowly drowned it in his own lungs. Gone was the granite mountain of a man who had serviced the machinery at Copper's for 50 years, the Dad who had driven us around America, his tanned, muscular arm protruding from the driver's window. He was so diminished. He looked as if he could barely stand, let alone clamber onto a roof and fix the most high-tech television antenna in Gainesville. His appearance shocked me to the core. He was only 64, but he looked 15 years older. Shakily, he got to his feet, clinging to the arm of his chair. "Hey, Dad," I said, holding out Jesse. "Meet your grandson." "I can't hold him. I've got to sit down," he said, collapsing back into his chair. It was summer, and the house was like an oven. I could hardly breathe myself. Looking up at me weakly, he managed a half-smile as I lowered Jesse into his lap. He looked down at his grandson and then up at me, a shine in his watery eyes. "Well, hello, Jesse," he said. "I'm your Grandpa Felder." Looking up at me again, studying my scraggly beard, handlebar mustache, mutton chops, and shoulder-length hair with a frown, he complained, "Don't you think it's time you went to the barber's, Doc, now that you're a father?" Within a year, he was dead. I had spent some time with him on that initial visit, buying an air conditioning unit to keep him cool and help him breathe, which he refused to switch on for fear of the electric bills. I offered him money, but he was too proud to accept. I had taken some Eagles records and played them to him on his old music center and tried to explain to him how successful the band was, but I don't think he ever really understood. All he said about the music was, "There's no horns. I like horns." His decline was quite rapid after my visit, and he was admitted to the North Central Florida Hospital, from where Jerry called me. I raced there from the West Coast, and when I arrived, Dad was hooked up to a special machine that sprayed mist to keep his airways clear. It reminded me of the iron lungs of my polio-scarred youth. "Hey, Dad," I said, leaning over the bed to kiss him. "It's Don." "When you gonna cut your hair and look like a man?" he growled through dry lips as my hair brushed his cheek. They were among the last words he ever spoke to me. After a week of taking turns with Mom and Jerry in a bedside vigil, I had to go back to L.A. He died a few days later. My third flight to Gainesville in less than a year was for his funeral, but the finality of his passing didn't hit me until I walked into the William Thomas Funeral Home, where my friend Jim and I had played frisbee as kids, and stared down at my father's emaciated body lying in an open casket. He was dressed in a Sunday suit, a shirt and tie, his arms folded across his chest. I had never seen his fingernails so clean. A flood of sorrow overcame me. There was still so much unresolved. Jerry and I hugged each other and wept. He had been there for my parents all these years when I was an absentee son, and I felt tremendous guilt about never having a proper adult relationship with my father. Now it was too late. I was filled with remorse about this loss, not just of his life, but so much else. When you lose a parent, the child in you dies. In the space of a year, I had gained a son and lost a father, and it felt like such a huge transition. Everything had changed, and I was rushing through my life at a furious pace, not doing anything justice. Sobbing in my brother's arms, I mourned the death of my father with an intensity I had never expected. He was, I realized, the strongest single influence in my life. He taught me all he knew about music, bought me my first real guitar, and encouraged me to play. Everything I was, everything I had achieved, was because of him. "God bless you, Dad," I whispered, and promised him silently that one day I'd cut my hair. In late 1974, we went back to the record plant to make a new album. There had been a short lull after the On the Border tour, but then Asylum turned the screws for a follow-up record. I wasn't looking forward to a return in the pressure cooker atmosphere of the studio, especially not with the added burden of bettering the last gold-selling product. We knew the critics were waiting in the wings, knives sharpened to cut us up and to serve us in little pieces to the public. At least on the road there had been enough space and time to get along reasonably well, but even out of the studio the differences that had been evident since I had joined the previous year grew and grew. The band was becoming increasingly divided by the tensions within it, based on the type of music we played. In such a prickly environment, no new songs were immediately forthcoming. Bernie, meanwhile, became increasingly dissatisfied with how the pair of them treated him and Randy. He didn't like them taking rough mixes back to their house to decide what tracks would stay or go, nor did he and Randy like what they described as Glenn's ability to change a word and gain a third, coming to a song that was in their minds substantially done with lyrics and music, making what to them seemed to be modest contributions, and suddenly becoming entitled to a third of the songwriting royalties. I just wanted to keep my head down and do the best I could, even if the song credits were sometimes out of whack. The new album was professionally called One of These Nights. The title track originally began life as an R&B song on acoustic piano, but it just didn't sound right to me when Glenn first played it to us. Randy was stuck in Nebraska, snowed in, and couldn't get to the studio, so I told Glenn, "Wait a minute, I'll play bass." I came up with an introduction and bass figure. We played a couple of demo passes with me playing the bass part over Glenn's piano, and I wound up writing the entire bass line for the title track. When the weather finally cleared and Randy was able to fly in, I taught him what I had written, verbatim, and we recorded it for the album. As long as the track came out good, I didn't care. I also wrote a song called Visions, for which Don provided some of the lyrics, the only Eagles track I ever sang lead vocal on. I penned that song in my house in Topanga. It was the most up-tempo track of the whole album. I was still not confident about my singing voice, especially not when I had Don's to compete it with, but I tried really hard, and the fact that Don and Glenn designed to let me sing it must have meant something. I reasoned even if the track was sort of thrown onto the album at the last minute, and I wasn't especially proud of the vocals. At one point in the lyrics, Don and Glenn sang, "Play on El Chingadero, play on." I learned later that Chingadero in Spanish loosely translates to mother. Someone once asked me which Eagles song I wrote by myself. The answer is not one. It would be interesting to hear what the answer would be if you asked Don Henley and Glenn Frey the same question. Those two would go hibernate somewhere and come up with the lyrics or the melody or the chords or often all three, and only when they'd emerge with finished product would the rest of us help come up with ideas for how it should be performed. After the Thrill Is Gone was an idea Glenn had. He loved B.B. King's The Thrill Is Gone, and while working to perfect a particular sound he wanted, he piped up, "Hey, how about calling it After the Thrill Is Gone?" Our work together was almost always like that, a collaborative process in which each one of us, while not exactly writing the songs, helped shape the final product. I'd work tirelessly on pieces of music that came into my head, mixing and tinkering with them at home before excitedly going to Don or Glenn when I thought I might have something. "Hey Glenn, I've been working on some licks and I'd like to play them for you," I'd say, guitar in hand. Glenn would look up from whatever he was doing and say something that became the catchphrase of the whole recording process. "I'll tell you when." Then he'd go right back to his work. "Maybe we should schedule some time for you to listen to them," I'd push, ever hopeful. "I'll tell you when," came the gruff reply. When the Eagles first started, Bernie had been the proverbial fair-haired child. He was by far the best instrumentalist and played most of the great guitar, banjo, mandolin, and pedal steel parts. With On the Border, the band had deliberately shifted away from that direction. By one of these nights, that shift had been graven in stone. To Bernie, life was pretty much black and white. He didn't like rock and roll. He liked country. That's really where his soul was and what he did impeccably well. He could play anything with strings, but that sound wasn't what Don and Glenn wanted anymore. They did try to accommodate his taste sometimes. For example, there's a definite attempt to maintain a country sound to Lion Eyes, but for Bernie, it was never enough. He and I would jam together all the time in hotel rooms and in between studio takes just for fun, playing all those smoky mountain tunes he taught me back in Gainesville, but bluegrass didn't sell millions of albums. When Bernie repeatedly resisted the attempt to shift gears, personalities clashed and the arguments became even more explosive. As much as we were friends, he didn't want the band to head in the direction Bill Seismic and the introduction of my guitar work was taking it. In fighting to win his point, he lost friendships, especially Glenn. I felt Glenn was the type of person who felt you were either with him or against him. If you didn't agree with him 100%, you were his enemy. Bernie had seemingly argued his way out of Glenn's camp. Bernie was living with Patty Davis, the daughter of California Governor Ronald Reagan. He had first met her over at Fred Wilecki's Westwood Music. She had even come on the European leg of our last tour, much to her father's disgust, especially as he was planning to run for president and the story made People magazine. Feeling left out now, Bernie insisted that Patty attend our studio sessions and be given a writing credit on the album for his song I Wish You Peace, something the rest of the band weren't at all sure about. It was only much later that I realized that that song was Bernie's farewell to us all. Tired of the constant bickering and madly in love with Patty, Bernie began to lose interest. One night we gathered in the studio to hear what we had recorded that day. For one track, we really wanted his input, but he stood up, threw his hands in the air, and said, "I'm going surfing." He didn't return for 3 days. It was a crucial time in the recording process, and his absence caused serious problems for the rest of us. There was so much strife and conflict during this time, it was wearing everyone down. Cocaine became my solve, and I went from being so disinterested that I'd given my coke to a truck driver to being a man obsessed. It was Bernie who had first took me to one side and warned me of the dangers. I asked him if he had any, and he gave me a small vial, like the ones we all used to tap onto our thumbnails, but I tapped so hard that much more than the normal quantity came tumbling out. I couldn't put it back, so I just snorted it all up while Bernie stood watching. "Hey man," he said, alarm in his eyes, "you gotta be careful with that stuff. It'll run away with you, you know. Don't fry your brain." I stopped and stared at him, my eyes and nostrils still smarting, and realized that maybe he was right. I had always managed to avoid being hooked on anything before, and now wasn't the time to start. The argument simmered on, while I did what I could to mediate. The band moved on from the early days, I told Bernie over and over. We've evolved. Don and Glenn have formed the strongest songwriting team, and that's best for the band. They're entitled to have the final say. Despite all the promises of equal shares, I still felt like the hired hand, the session man who had been invited in to hang around and take what crumbs I could get, but Bernie had been a founding member and refused to accept that. You weren't there in the beginning, he'd tell me, when the Eagles were a band and everybody got 2 songs. That's all been forgotten, and it stinks. He was headstrong and stubborn. He felt Glenn didn't have the authority to dictate what should or shouldn't be on an album, especially when he and Don decided that they didn't want Bernie to sing solo at all, that they didn't like his B-string Bender guitar or the abstract banjo-driven sound of his instrumental number, Journey of the Sorcerer, and that they hated I Wish You Peace. Bernie and I had always been close, but I knew he had a short fuse. So did Glenn. If not about the songs, then they began to fight over everything, from where we should tour to what the merchandising should look like, until none of us knew where to put ourselves. I continued trying to play a diplomatic role between the 2 factions. I'd go to Bernie to support and encourage him and try to give him confidence in his writing and playing, and then I'd remind the guys what a key player he was in the band. I found myself constantly trying to help this thing stay together, but it seemed like Don and Glenn had already decided that Bernie wasn't suited to the band anymore, chiefly because they were so dissatisfied with the struggle he had presented. It was always Bernie against the 2 of them. They unified against his writings, playing style, lyrics, voice, and guitar tone. No matter what he did, it was no longer good enough. I only got through that difficult time because I had Susan and Jessie waiting at home for me. I tried not to bring the bad stuff home and unload it onto her because I knew she was struggling with the demands of being a new mother. She helped me sort it out anyway, and her common sense attitude always brought me down to earth. Better still, because of my new responsibilities, I rarely if ever took drugs at home, which probably saved my life. I remember coming home one morning at about 5 a.m. when Jessie was 6 months old, after another long session at the record plant. I was still cranked out on coke, sniffing and grinding my teeth, and had somehow managed to drive my pickup all the way back to Topanga. Instead of joining Susan in bed, I sat out on the balcony and watched the clouds roll in from the ocean as the sun came up above them. I was soaring like an eagle, literally way above those clouds, zoned into another cosmos. I sat there for almost an hour until I heard Jessie's first morning cry. I heard Susan get out of bed and tend to him. I listened to her moving around, and I wanted to go in and say hello, but I couldn't pull myself together enough to move from my chair. When I finally managed to get my legs working and staggered inside, I was met with the sobering reality of a wife and a baby. The look on Susan's face was not something I ever wanted to see again. "Look at the state you're in," she said. "Don't you ever come home this stoned again." She drove the point home that this was not acceptable behavior for the father of her child. I got the message. More and more, I didn't come home at all. Sleeping over in the S&M room at the record plant instead, a place that suddenly seemed very appealing. In many ways, I think Susan was as happy with the arrangement as I was. The little sleep she was getting wouldn't be disturbed by my crashing in at 5 a.m., and she was relieved I wasn't driving home alone with coke in my pocket and paranoid delusions that every set of headlights behind me was a cop car. It was different when I went back out on the road, though, and was away all the time. Off we went that summer, and Susan was left by herself in Topanga, feeling increasingly isolated. Her parents had retired to Florida. Mine were there, too. The friends she had made in the valley lived miles away. There were no other Eagles' wives to be friendly with. Randy's was in Nebraska. I was on the road with Bernie, her nearest neighbor, and she had few friends locally to talk to or help her care for the baby. One day she took Jessie outside and laid a blanket out on the grass so he could get a little sun while she cleaned the house. The area around the property was rough bush, full of coyote, and she was always cautious. Looking down, she was just about to lay him on the blanket when she spotted a small rattlesnake coiled right beside him. It was one snake too much for a Boston girl. I was out in the boonies somewhere in a crummy hotel late at night when she found my number from the itinerary. "We've got to get out of Topanga," she said, crying. "There's far too many critters. I want to sell the house and find us somewhere else, Don. Somewhere with neighbors we can talk to." "Oh, okay, honey," I said, half asleep and more than a little bemused. It felt so strange having her telling me where we were going to be living while I was thousands of miles away. She arranged everything and sold our house to the actor Will Geer, who played Grandpa in the Waltons television show. She found us a pretty 1950s Cape Cod-style house painted pink inside and out, right on the sand at Broad Beach at the furthest point of Malibu, just before it becomes Ventura County. The first time she took me in there, I inhaled the fresh, salty air and looked at the deep, powdery sand several hundred feet wide to the shore and knew she had made the right decision. Susan had erected a little swing set and an inflatable pool for Jessie in the front yard, which was like a giant sandbox. My only complaint about the house was the color. Some of the rooms were so shockingly pink, you had to wear sunglasses to enter them. The actress Ally McGraw, famous for the hit movie Love Story, had been the last tenant. Miss McGraw moved there 3 doors down from her boyfriend, Steve McQueen, next door to Keith Moon. Our other neighbors included Jack Lemmon, Joe Crocker, Goldie Hawn, Dick Martin, and Donald Sutherland. I didn't suddenly feel incredibly rich living alongside such people. On the contrary, I felt incredibly in debt. I was laboring under the delusion that being in a rock band would automatically make me fabulously wealthy. Without paying a great deal of concern to the dollars and cents, I just went along with what was offered. My new business manager, Jerry Verslar, along with his partner Joel Jacobson, both recommended by Irving, kept all the accounts and told me what I could or couldn't do. I was young and carefree, happy with the way my life was going. As long as there was cash in the bank, I didn't feel the need to doubt anyone. That was the way the rest of the band operated too, and probably most of our famous neighbors. Business managers take care of all that stuff, Keith Moon once reminded me. Relax, that's what you're paying them for, man. I was still driving the international pickup truck when I was in L.A., but I wanted Susan and Jessie to have something better than the old Volvo with 1,000,000 miles on it, so I went to see my business manager. "Can I afford to buy my wife a new car?" I asked Jerry. "Sure," he replied, smiling. "What do you want?" With the authority vested in my pen and a phone call from Jerry's company, I was approved for the purchase of a brand new Chevy Vega family station wagon. Chevrolet out of loyalty to my father, but it turned out to be one of the worst automobiles I ever bought. The first thing it did was break down on the freeway with Jessie in the baby seat. Susan took it to the shop and had it fixed, but it broke down again. The Volvo had never once let us down, and as we hadn't yet sold it, she went back to driving that. We talked to Jerry about replacing the Chevy, and he recommended a Mercedes. "I've been driving them for years, and they're really great," he told us confidently. I didn't feel ready for a Mercedes. It seemed a step too far, but Susan was all for it. "Let's just go take a look," she pleaded, then drove me to the Beverly Hills Mercedes dealership, where she fell in love with the little 4-door chocolate brown 280. I was relieved she hadn't gone for one of the big Merces for cigar-smoking rich men, so I arranged to buy the 280 on monthly payments. After that, I felt much better leaving her and Jessie to go out on the road, even though I was heavily in debt with a car and a house. My father, who never owned a penny to anyone, would have thrown up his hands. One of these nights became our first album to debut at number 1, when it was released in June 1975 as Saigon Fell, and it helped every other Eagles album skyrocket in sales. The title track, released as a single with me playing the precise guitar solo I had created for it, leaped into the top 10. The underlying theme of Hollywood, with all its good and evil, struck a chord with critics and fans alike. The band had progressed from being dust-covered outlaws in the desert to living it up in the Hollywood hills. Songs like Lion Eyes, with its incredibly evocative lyrics, enhanced our reputation for not only playing great music, but for telling a story too. The idea for that particular track came one night in Dan Tana's restaurant next to the Troubadour. We were sitting at a table when we noticed a pretty young blonde with a much older but clearly wealthy man. Glenn laughed and turned to the group and said, "Look at those lion eyes." Don and Glenn received all the credit for writing 5 of the 9 songs on the new album. The album marked another milestone. It moved Don to the front of the band. His days of singing as many songs as Glenn had ended. We embarked on a sold-out world tour of 59 stadiums. Lion Eyes was their second single, reaching number 2 on the pop charts and crossing over to the country charts. Take It to the Limit, sung so soulfully by Randy, rose to number 4, becoming our 4th consecutive top 5 single. Bernie's songs I Wish You Peace, for which Patti Davis received joint credit, and Journey of the Sorcerer were never released as singles. Neither was the song that Randy and I wrote together, Too Many Hands, a raucous rock and roll number with a rhythm guitar riff that Don and Glenn had really liked, and with toe-to-toe guitar solos by Glenn and me. That song actually made my hands bleed. The basic track was played on a 12-string acoustic guitar, which you need the hands of a gorilla to play because it just eats you up. During the recording at the record plant, I took a break and jumped into the scum pond to relax a little. The hot water softened the calluses on my hands, and when I went back in to finish laying down the track, the skin of my fingers opened up and bled. Our new album, more than all the others, was composed of mainstream AM-oriented cuts. Song structure, choruses, vocals, even the length, everything was written to be more commercial and achieve national and international airplay. AM radio used to play a set number of songs per hour, with the commercial slots in between. A 5 or 6 minute piece of music cost the station a commercial segue. 3 minutes 30 seconds was the limit, they insisted, or they wouldn't play it. Lion Eyes was 5 minutes long and initially didn't get much airplay, but it bucked the trend and proved to us that, with the right track, anything is possible. In September 1975, we were on the cover of Rolling Stone, a first for us. There was a front-page photograph of us all looking cool on a yacht in Chicago, wearing aviator sunglasses and an article raving about how great we were. With typical media perversity, however, in the back of the same issue there was a formal record review panning our new album. For some critics we were ballad-heavy and theatrically boring. We didn't have fireworks or wear makeup like Kiss, whose album Alive had sparked Kiss Mania. Fans could buy everything from Kiss makeup to Kiss-endorsed pinball machines. We didn't leap around on stage and smash guitars like The Who, or dress in outrageous costumes like Elton John. The critics were missing the point. The Eagles were always about songwriting and song power, reaching people and touching their hearts with words or music that meant something. We wanted our songs to endure. Compare any Eagles verses to the repetitive head-banging lyrics by some of these rock opera bands. We didn't need gimmicks, nor did we need to sell lunchboxes with our faces on them. Don Henley was especially incensed about the Rolling Stone review and immediately fired off one of his poison pen letters to the editor. To be fair to him, this time I think he was probably right. The magazine was using our celebrity to sell its product, and at the same time telling the world we sucked. It was a perfect example of how the press sometimes exploits artists for its own benefit. For us, this was a stark realization. It sparked an ongoing feud with the media, and especially with Rolling Stone, which had never really been resolved. Interviews were kept to a bare minimum after that, or strictly controlled by Irving, Don, and Glenn, and the Eagles consequently became one of the most intensely private bands in the world. The same month as the prestigious cover article, we played to a crowd of 55,000 people at Anaheim Stadium. It was the biggest gig we had ever done in Southern California since the California Jam, which I had missed, an incredible, memorable night. It was the 20th anniversary of James Dean's death, which meant a great deal to Glenn, who was a big fan. We followed Jackson Browne and Linda Ronstadt, and I can remember looking out at the sea of eager young fans camped out under the spotlights while the stage literally shook with the reverberation of their cheering and foot stomping. After the gig, we went backstage and bumped into my friend and Malibu neighbor, Carole King, who at the time was married to a lovely guy called Rick Evers. I had never seen Carole happier than she was with him. He was a songwriter and part-time leathersmith, and he presented each of us that night with beautiful handmade hide coats. I still have mine. I wore it in one of the Eagles' photo shoots. It's sheepskin with tassels, Indian motifs, and elkhorn buttons. It's exquisite, and I cherished it, both the memory of that extraordinary night and in remembrance of Rick, who tragically died of a heroin overdose a few years later. Time magazine named us the top U.S. rock band. The article described each of us in turn. I was a recluse because, at my last house, an 8-mile-long dirt road separates Felder's rustic ridgeline house from the Pacific Coast Highway far below. Don was called a card-carrying intellectual, Glenn a charming, harmless ladies' man, Randy a happily married family man, and Bernie a loner who prowls music stores for new instruments. Right on, I'd say. Far better than the incredible accolade of that article, though, which would have impressed even my father, was going back to my home state with the band. We had a gig playing on Florida Field in Gainesville where the Gators play. I invited Jerry, his wife, and their kids, Mary and Brian, to come and see my show. Instead of staying in the hotel with the band, I rented a condominium in a golfing resort for 4 days, and Susan and Jesse joined in. I arranged for a stretch limousine, to pick up my brother and his wife and kids and give them front row seats at the side of the stage. It was one of the first times in all these years that Jerry had seen me play, and here I was, standing center stage in front of a crowd of tens of thousands, playing rock and roll guitar just like I used to in the bedroom we had shared. I think he realized then the magnitude of what had happened with the Eagles and how successful we had become. Later that night, in the kitchen of our condo, we sat chatting about Mom and Dad and our childhood when he suddenly got up, came over to where I was sitting, and hugged me. "I'm sorry I wasn't a very good big brother to you, Don," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked, choked up. "Well, I was pretty mean and beat you up and made you wash my car all the time. I think I should have been there for you more. I apologize." I told him not to even think that, and we embraced as we had in the funeral parlor where Dad died. That night, I think we both recognized that our childhood hadn't always been easy. With our continuing success and the simmering disagreements that lay behind it, life on the road became wilder and wilder as we toured North America, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, England, Germany, Holland, and France. Drugs and women featured heavily, and individual band members began to let their guard down. Halfway through the American leg of the tour, during a rare break of 7 days, we decided to fly to Nassau in the Bahamas and get some rest. We had been flying around and dashing here and there in rental cars. We were exhausted. It made sense to stay out on the road rather than fly home, unpack, and repack a few days later. So we chartered a Learjet out of North Carolina and slipped down to a place in the Caribbean called Paradise Island. I recall when we arrived at Nassau's tiny airport, custom officials greeted us with some suspicion. Here we were, long-haired hippies with ripped jeans in the rock business. I suppose we seemed like fair game. I had nothing to fear. I wasn't carrying any drugs, and as far as I knew, nobody else was either, because that's what we had agreed. Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones had been caught bringing drugs through customs once, as Paul McCartney would later in Japan. We didn't want to be tarred with the same brush. Needless to say, the customs men pulled us over and started asking questions. Irving was running around, but I told him to chill. "It's okay, Irv," I whispered. "Nobody's carrying." At that point, I saw Bernie stop, reach down, open his bag, and scatter handfuls of pills across the baggage area floor. As people arrived from another flight, we could hear the pills being crunched underfoot. Glenn dragged Irving to one side for a quiet word. As the customs officers pulled each of us in and started searching through everything, the linings of our suitcases, our clothes, Glenn moved his way further to the back of the line so that he was the last one to be searched. When Glenn was searched, he was waved through. We grabbed our bags, headed out to the taxi stand, and piled into a series of cars. We'd only been off the airport complex a few minutes when Glenn pulled off one of his cowboy boots, retrieved some pot stuffed into the toe of it, and sat in the back rolling a big fat joint. The time still grew wilder. I remember coming off stage in Amsterdam once, sweating profusely, and a fan who had somehow managed to get backstage was standing there waiting for me, waving a huge brick of hash. "Give me your t-shirt and I'll give you this," he said. I looked down at my soggy, sweat-stained Eagles t-shirt, which I was about to throw away anyway, and nodded with a grin. Peeling it off, I made the best trade ever. Trouble was, we were leaving the country the next morning, and there was more hash in this softball-sized block than I could possibly smoke, so I handed it out to everyone I knew, the band, road crew, lighting guys, everyone. I was the most popular Eagle that day. Touring was so much fun, especially when we did gigs that also featured the Rolling Stones or Tina Turner. The best part of the whole gig was when she came on stage. She'd light the place up, especially when she and Jagger sang Proud Mary. The audience and even the band members seemed to crank it up a notch or two, just because of her presence. We all knew she'd have a great solo career ahead of her, if she wanted it. The Stones were pretty wild boys, especially Keith Richards, who played real dirty. Neanderthal guitar and was a walking human chemistry set. I remember arriving at our first hotel in Kansas City, a Holiday Inn or a Marriott, and being taken to meet the boys. My tour guide was our ever-smiling, supremely likable, and unflinchingly dedicated road manager who had been with the Eagles from the very beginning, and who was good friends with many of the other road managers. The Stones kept to themselves usually, and we weren't allowed on the top 2 floors they occupied, which could only be reached by elevator and were patrolled by private security guards. Richie got the okay on the telephone for us to go up, then escorted us. When the elevator doors opened, a wall of pot smoke hit us. We wandered into a room, and on the dressing table was a large mountain of what looked like dirty cocaine. I didn't know what it was. Someone in the room asked, "Hey, you want some H?" And I realized that I was looking at heroin for the first time. I passed. I had seen what heroin did to young guys living rough in New York, and for me, that was a step too far. I drank a beer instead, and we sat chatting for a while until Richie said to the tour manager, "So, where are the guys? Don would sure like to meet Keith Richards." "Okay," the road manager said. "Come with me." He led us down a corridor and into a large suite, its doors thrown open. From a distance, it sounded like there was some enormous party going on. The music was so loud, but when we walked in, the room was empty except for a giant stereo system, about 3 feet tall and 6 feet wide, on casters. It could be wheeled into a room, opened up like a road case, and plugged in. There was a guitar amp built in with 2 huge speakers, and it was cranking out some really heavy rock and roll track. "Maybe he's in the bedroom," someone said, and we wandered into his bedroom and stared at the detritus of what had obviously already been a good night. Jack Daniels bottles, beer bottles, clothes, and the residue of drugs. "Nope, not here," Richie said, and we started to walk out. Just then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man's foot sticking out of the open bathroom door. "Jesus," I said. I ran around to find what nobody wants to discover. Keith Richards doing a very good impersonation of a corpse. His skin was gray, and he was completely motionless, face down on the bathroom floor. I thought he was dead. Barely batting an eye, the road manager grabbed the phone and called the tour doctors. Richie and I were unceremoniously ushered from the room and into the elevator. "I'm sure he's a goner, man," I told him as we returned to our floor. "I've only ever seen one person look like that before, and he was in his coffin." To my astonishment, there was no bulletin on the news that night, and the following evening at the Kansas City Stadium, a very much alive Keith Richards, looking none the worse for his brush with death, pranced around the stage cranking out his raunchy rock and roll guitar for all he was worth. Now that's what I call stamina. That's the end of Chapter 10. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 10 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.